The Krell remembered the first time they saw humans. They remembered the way those small, soft creatures walked into the Grand Council chamber of the Galactic Concord, shoulders straight, eyes forward, carrying themselves as if they belonged among titans. And they remembered the laughter. The Krell had always been a people of strength. Their bodies were sheathed in jagged scales harder than steel. Their lungs could breathe poison as easily as air, and their forehearts beat with relentless endurance. To them, power was flesh and bone, muscle and fang. Anything less was weakness. Anything fragile was prey. And humans were fragile. They walk on two weak legs. Admiral Serac had sneered that day, his voice booming through the hall of armored generals. He stood taller than any human delegate, his scaled bulk wrapped in gilded war armor, a living statue of conquest. Their skin burns in sunlight. Their bodies collapse in vacuum. They suffocate without machines. Their bones break like dry sticks. This species is a joke. The chamber erupted with laughter. Krell generals slammed clawed fists against their chests in amusement, their armored tails lashing with cruel delight. Even the representatives of other empires smirked. Who could take such a fragile species seriously? But not everyone laughed. At Serac's side stood Valar, his young aide, barely risen from the warrior ranks. He laughed with the others because that was what was expected. Yet as he did, his eyes wandered to the human delegation. They did not shrink under the mockery. They did not shout back nor lower their heads. They simply stood there, silent, their faces unreadable but their eyes sharp, watching, listening. There was no prideful bluster, no display of strength, only stillness. And Valar noticed something the others did not. Humans flinched when insulted, yes. Their faces betrayed emotion too easily. But they did not retreat. They did not leave. They endured. The laughter echoed long after the humans departed. The Krell called Earth a glass world waiting to be shattered. They whispered jokes of how the fragile ones would shiver at the first sight of war. Serac himself declared that if the humans ever raised a fleet, it would collapse under its own weight before it even left orbit. But Valar remembered those eyes. Quiet, watchful, like embers waiting for air. Fragility, the Krell believed, was weakness. To be fragile was to be broken easily, discarded, forgotten. To them, fragility was the opposite of strength. Yet Valar had doubts. Fragility meant something else, didn't it? Fragility meant knowing you could be broken and choosing to stand anyway. Fragility meant living with the awareness of death pressing close at all times, yet still walking forward. He said nothing then. What was one young officer against the certainty of the Krell Empire? But years later, when the first Krell ships descended upon a human colony, when Serac ordered the bombardments to begin, when humans met fire with silence, and silence with defiance, Valar remembered. He remembered the stillness in their eyes. The Krell mocked them as fragile. And for a time, the galaxy believed it. But fragility was not weakness. Fragility was the seed of something else, something the Krell would not understand until it was far too late. And as the fires of war drew near, fragility would prove itself to be unstoppable. The Krell descended on New Carthage expecting silence. The colony was small, perched on the rim of human expansion, a scarred and stubborn place built on rock and dust. To the Krell, it was nothing but a fragile outpost clinging to survival, a perfect target for a demonstration of power. Admiral Serac wanted blood not for strategy, but for spectacle. They will cry for mercy within an hour, Serac declared aboard his dreadnought, Dominance of Dawn. His command chamber glowed with crimson light as the fleet slid into orbit. We will crush their spirits before the rest of their kind even knows we have come. But there was no cry. When the first bombardment struck, flattening New Carthage's comm towers and igniting its storage depots, there were no desperate pleas over the comm channels. There were no wails for mercy, no surrender signals blinking against the void. There was only silence. Serac laughed at it. Even their voices failed them, he mocked. The Krell officers joined his laughter, certain the humans cowered in fear. Too broken to resist, but on the ground it was different. Beneath the cracked streets, families huddled in makeshift shelters dug into the bedrock. The air stank of smoke and burned plastic, but they passed water bottles hand to hand, whispering to keep children calm. Generators cobbled together from mining equipment pushed stale oxygen through the tunnels. Above them, engineers scrambled through the ruins, their hands blackened by fire and ash. They stripped wiring from broken factories, rerouted circuits by hand, and rewired battered defense turrets with scavenged parts. Sparks burned their skin, but they kept working. Soldiers, if they could even be called that, held the streets. Miners wielded drills and cutting torches like weapons. Farmers gripped hunting rifles, their knuckles white. Mechanics carried pipe wrenches in trembling hands. Their armor was nothing more than work suits and dust-stained jackets, and yet they did not flee. When the Krell sent their first dropships to sweep the city, they met resistance. Humans emerged from smoke-filled alleys, hurling explosives built from fertilizer and scrap fuel. Others climbed the dropships themselves, tearing into their engines with makeshift charges. Every street became a trap, every building a nest for ambush. They died by the dozens, then the hundreds. And still they fought. Reports streamed back to the Krell fleet, each one more absurd than the last. Units delayed by mining equipment. Hostiles using flame against our boarding teams. Casualties, higher than expected. Serac laughed louder with every word. Do you see? They throw themselves against us with tools and toys, fragile things flailing before the inevitable. But Valar was silent. He had watched the footage. He had seen a woman with blood streaked across her face drag a wounded comrade from the rubble, holding the line with a welding torch until her arms gave out. He had seen a boy no older than 15, carrying ammunition for soldiers who were already dead. Valar felt a chill that Serac and the others could not. Fragile things were supposed to break. Yet these humans, soft, small, delicate humans, did not break. They bled, they burned, they buried their dead in shallow graves beneath shattered streets. But they did not yield. When the last holdout of New Carthage finally fell, there was no surrender. The defenders fought until nothing remained to fight with. Their weapons ran dry, their barricades crumbled, their lungs filled with ash. And still, in those final transmissions, there were no pleas, only defiance. Serac sat on his throne of steel and laughed again. See, they die quickly like insects, but Valar could not laugh. Not anymore, because insects scatter when fire touches their nest. These humans had not scattered. They had stood in the flames, their fragile bodies blackened and broken, but their spirit unbent. As the Krell ships lifted away from the ruined colony, Valar's claws tapped nervously against the console. The humans had shown him something his people had overlooked. Fragility was not the same as weakness. Fragility endured. And endurance, he realized, was dangerous. News of New Carthage spread across Earth like wildfire. At first, there was disbelief. A colony gone? Families, workers, children, all slaughtered in the span of days. The official reports were sterile, filled with numbers and casualty counts, but the unfiltered transmissions told the truth. Fragments of desperate voices, a miner cursing into his last breath, a mother's whisper, calming her child as the roof came down, silence that followed when the lines went dead. The world did not weep quietly. The world changed. Factories that once forged tractors and harvesters stripped their assembly lines clean. Within weeks, they were hammering out armor plating and loading missile racks onto frames never meant for war. Civilian freighters were gutted, their cargo holds refitted into barracks and their cranes into weapon mounts. Cities rang with the sound of welding torches and hammers. Old ships that had hauled ore for generations were reborn in flame, welded back together with weapons of desperation. They weren't sleek. They weren't beautiful, but they were human and they were ready. And it wasn't just machines that awakened, it was people. Children carried water and supplies to workers on the lines. Artists painted banners and murals that stirred hope in weary streets. Farmers sent their harvest not to market, but to military depots. Teachers and doctors became organizers, strategists, healers for the wounded who returned from raids. Humanity's great heartbeat had been scattered, faint, divided. Now for the first time in centuries it beat as one. In the command chambers of the Krell, Serac scoffed when the reports arrived. They patch their ships with scrap. They line their fleets with garbage. They cannot stand against us. His generals agreed, their laughter ringing off polished walls, but Valar didn't laugh. He studied the grainy human broadcasts that slipped through the filters. A freighter-turned battleship crawling with mismatched cannons. A woman in a patched flight suit saluting the camera before takeoff, eyes wet but voice steady. dock workers singing as they welded steel, their voices echoing like hymns of defiance. This wasn't desperation. It was transformation. The Krell had grown powerful in conquest, leaning on their fleets of steel and their centuries of dominance. But they had forgotten hunger. They had forgotten loss. They had forgotten what it meant to be fragile, and to rise anyway. On Earth, leaders gathered not in gilded halls but in cramped bunkers lit by humming generators. They spoke not of surrender, but of memory. "We did not want this war," Admiral Kwan of the United Earth Defense said, her voice carried across every screen. "We chose peace. We chose to build, not destroy. But they came. They burned our homes. They mocked our lives. And now they will learn what fragile truly means." The people didn't roar. They didn't cheer. They simply nodded. They understood. This wasn't about vengeance. This was about survival, about proving to the galaxy that humanity would not vanish quietly into the dark. Across the stars, the Krell continued to laugh. They saw fragile hands holding rifles, fragile ships creaking under new armor, fragile voices whispering promises of resistance, and the humans whispered back to one another, "Let them laugh. We will answer with silence, with fire." This was no longer a scattered species clinging to scraps of rock. This was no longer a world mocked for its weakness. This was awakening. It wasn't born in pride. It wasn't born in anger alone. It was born in grief, in loss, in a fragility that could not be broken. Humanity had never chosen violence as its first path. But when survival demanded it, their fragile hands shaped themselves into blades, and when the blades were drawn, the galaxy would tremble. The first true clash between human fleets and the Krell Empire was meant to be a lesson. For the Krell, it was supposed to remind the galaxy that rebellion was hopeless. Their dreadnoughts gleamed in formation, silver hulls reflecting the cold stars. Their weapons arrays glowed with gathered energy, each capable of breaking a continent. From Admiral Sarak's throne on the flagship, the humans looked like little more than an inconvenience, one that would be silenced quickly. "End it," he ordered, his voice a growl of satisfaction. "Let them see how quickly their courage burns away." But courage did not burn. It flared. The human fleet emerged from the dark like ghosts. Civilian freighters turned into warships, mining rigs bristling with crude cannons, fuel barges armored with plating ripped from scrapyards. They looked laughable beside the sleek Krell designs, a patchwork of rust scars and welded steel. The Krell laughed. Sarak sneered. "A child's toys." Then the battle began. The first wave of human ships didn't fire missiles or energy weapons. They released containers, metal cylinders tumbling through the void, splitting open to scatter a cloud of glittering particles. At first, the Krell ignored it. Then the alarms began to scream. "Admiral, sensors failing. Shields degrading." Our arrays, the dust was diamond, ground to powder by industrial drills. Billions of shards scoured the Krell shields, clogging systems, burning through delicate instruments. The dreadnought's sleek armor became a liability, its mirrored surface sandblasted into blindness. Sarak snarled, his claws digging into the arm of his chair. "Destroy them!" But the human ships did not fight like fleets of order and discipline. They fought like cornered predators. A mining vessel turned its drills outward, the massive steel teeth chewing into a Krell cruiser's hull. Sparks lit the void as armored plating screeched, tearing open like tin. Another ship, once a garbage hauler, hurled its cargo of compacted waste at ramming speed, blocks of metal and refuse striking with the force of artillery. And then the boarding began. Krell interceptors latched onto the human ships, confident in their superior soldiers. But when their airlocks breached, they found humans waiting, men and women with eyes like fire and tools turned into weapons. Welding torches cut through armor, plasma cutters carved flesh from scales. They fought not with grace but with fury born of desperation, every strike a scream of survival. Reports came too fast to process. Forward batteries offline. Portside cruiser breached. Enemy inside the command section. The unthinkable happened. One of the Krell warships, a vessel that had stood unbeaten in dozens of conquests, fell silent. Its engines sputtered, its lights died, and then, slowly, it broke apart, its pieces drifting through the void like shards of a shattered crown. For the first time in his long career, Admiral Sarak sat in silence. His sneer faded, replaced by something raw, something unfamiliar. Disbelief. This is impossible, he whispered, but Valar did not find it impossible. He found it inevitable. He had seen the look in the human's eyes on New Carthage. He had seen fragility endure fire and ash. Now he saw it turn to steel. He saw fragile hands gripping blades that cut deeper than any Krell weapon. Valar felt the weight of truth settle over him like ice. The humans weren't strong because they were unbreakable. They were strong because they had already broken, again and again, and still kept fighting. On the battlefield, one Krell officer shouted to Serac, "Admiral, we must retreat." But pride chained him. No retreat.
End them!
The battle dragged on, brutal and chaotic. Humans fell in droves, their fragile ships torn apart. But every loss carved a wound into the Krell fleet. Every explosion carried vengeance. Every death bought another strike. And when the smoke cleared, it was not the swift victory Serac had promised. It was a scar. A Krell dreadnought lay in ruins. Thousands of Krell warriors were dead. The humans, though battered, had not broken. Serac gripped the rail of his throne until his claws drew blood. His voice was a low growl of rage, but beneath it trembled something worse. Fear. For the first time, the Krell understood that the fragile species was dangerous, and for the first time, Valar believed they might lose. Victory had come, but it did not feel like victory. The first Krell dreadnought lay shattered in orbit above the human colony of Asterion Prime, its corpse of steel and fire drifting in silence. The galaxy would remember the day fragile humans had struck down one of the most feared ships in the Krell Armada. But for those who fought, there was no celebration. There was only silence. Hospitals overflowed. Ships returned scarred and bleeding, their hulls venting atmosphere patched with crude plates. Inside, men and women sat in silence, staring at nothing. The smell of smoke clung to them. Their hands trembled as if still holding weapons. Commander Yara sat in a dim ward, her arm wrapped in bandages. She had led a boarding party onto a Krell cruiser. Out of 30, only 8 returned. Her throat tightened when she saw the empty beds beside her. She could still hear their screams echoing in her helmet, the sound of tearing steel, the flash of plasma fire. "We won," she whispered to herself, as if repeating it would make it real. But the words tasted like ash. On Earth, the news spread like wildfire. Families huddled around glowing screens, waiting for the lists of names. Fathers buried sons. Mothers wept over folded flags. Children asked when their parents were coming home, and no one could give them answers. Humanity wore grief like a second skin. It was etched into every face, carved into every breath. The Krell expected surrender. They expected the humans to falter under such loss, to bow their heads and beg for peace. That was how other species had always reacted when their blood stained the stars. But humanity did not bend. They carried their grief into the fires of war. Engineers worked through tears, reforging ships with hands that shook from exhaustion. Doctors stitched wounds with their voices cracking, whispering promises to patients they weren't sure they could keep. Farmers grew food not just for their own tables, but for soldiers on distant fronts. Every scar became fuel. Every tear became fire. Valar saw this truth more clearly than ever. He had been given access to human prisoners of war. He studied them closely, curious about how such fragile creatures could endure so much. He found one soldier, Private Keen, strapped to a medical cot. His ribs were broken. One arm was gone, torn away in battle. His face was pale, drenched in sweat. Yet when Valar tried to speak with him, the human only stared, his one remaining hand curling into a fist. "You should be dead," Valar said softly. Not out of cruelty, but of bewilderment. Keen's lips cracked into a faint smile.
"Should be," he rasped.
"But I'm not," the words haunted Valar. The soldier was not just clinging to life. He was daring it to let go. Another prisoner, a woman named Mara, had burns down one side of her body. She winced with every breath, but her eyes did not dim. When Krell guards mocked her weakness, she whispered a single phrase over and over again. "We are still here." Fragile things were supposed to shatter. Fragile things were supposed to crumble. But these humans had redefined fragility. Their weakness was not a flaw, it was their strength. They felt every wound, carried every loss, but still they rose to fight again. Admiral Serac did not understand this. He called humans reckless, suicidal, pathetic in their refusal to yield. But Valar began to see the truth. Every time the Krell inflicted pain, they forged something harder within humanity. In the silence of a Krell prison bay, Vaylor whispered to himself. They do not win in spite of their pain. They win because of it. The humans carried their dead with them, not as weights, but as banners. Every scarred soldier was a reminder. Every burned city a vow. Their fragility was not an end, it was a beginning. And so, as the Krell prepared to strike deeper into Sol, convinced they would finally shatter humanity once and for all, Vaylor could not stop the gnawing fear inside him. Because he now knew the truth. The humans were fragile, yes, but fragility had teeth, and the weight of pain had given them a strength the galaxy had never seen. The Krell prepared their grand assault on Sol with the arrogance of conquerors. Entire fleets, sleek and sharpened like blades, cut through the void toward Earth. Admiral Sarak's flagship, the Blood of Krell, led the armada, its planet cracker weapon primed to tear humanity's cradle to dust. From his command chair, Sarak allowed himself a cruel smile. At last, the fragile species will be broken. Their home will be glass. Their spirit, ashes. Vaylor stood beside him, silent, unease gnawing at his chest. He remembered the look in the human's eyes, the whispers of prisoners. We are still here. Fragile, yes, but never broken. And now, as the Krell armada approached the jewel of humanity's birthworld, he could not shake the fear that Sarak's certainty was a lie. Earth waited. But it did not wait idly. From behind the rings of Saturn, shadows stirred. Entire fleets hidden in silence for months emerged like predators from the dark. Their hulls were scarred, patchwork, an insult to the perfection of Krell steel. Yet every rivet, every crude plate carried defiance. These were not machines built in factories. They were forged from desperation, from grief, from will. The humans struck first. A swarm of scrap ships surged forward, diving headlong into the Krell vanguard. They fought with reckless fury, turning weaknesses into weapons, ships held together by welds and prayers rammed into Krell cruisers, detonating in blossoms of fire. Civilian drills once meant to carve rock tore into alien hulls like spears. Even as human vessels split apart, their fragments became shrapnel that shredded Krell formations. Chaos ignited the stars. Vaylor gripped the edge of a console, his scales crawling with dread. The humans should have broken by now. They should have collapsed under the weight of their wounds. Instead, they burned brighter like a flame fed by every gust of pain the Krell had dealt them. Admiral Sarak snarled. Activate the planet cracker. End this mockery. The weapon roared to life, a blinding column of energy lashing toward Earth. For a moment, the human cradle seemed doomed. But then, light bent. The weapon's own fury arced back, folding in upon itself. A trap. The humans had woven their defenses into the fabric of space, turning Sarak's greatest weapon against him. The blood of Krell shook as the energy ripped through its shields, tearing into its armored spine. Systems exploded. Holographic displays blinked out in showers of sparks. Sarak's smug certainty shattered as his mighty dreadnought screamed beneath the weight of its own power. No, he whispered, his voice hollow. Impossible, but it was not impossible. It was human. Then came the boarding parties. Not Krell soldiers storming human ships, but humans storming Krell decks. They moved through smoke and fire with grim silence, not slaughtering indiscriminately, but disabling. Capturing. They were not here for vengeance. They were here for victory. Vaylor watched as humans forced open sealed doors with their bare hands, as they dragged wounded Krell to safety, rather than leaving them to burn. He saw them plant flags not as conquerors, but as survivors. Their voices echoed through alien halls, steady and unyielding. Your war is over. For the first time in his life, Vaylor felt hope, not for the Krell's triumph, but for their surrender. He saw in the humans' eyes a strength he had never understood. They were fragile, yes, but fragility had taught them mercy. Fragility had given them the courage to feel the weight of every death and still keep fighting. Sarak, broken and furious, slammed his claws against the console. Fight, damn you. They cannot defeat us. But his words fell flat, drowned by the sight of his dreadnought splitting apart, of Krell fleets scattering, of humans pressing forward with unstoppable momentum. The turning tide had come. And it was not steel or fire that carried it. It was the unyielding spirit of a species that refused to stay broken. In that moment, the galaxy changed. For the Krell, fear bloomed where arrogance once stood. For humanity, hope flared where despair had lingered. And for Vaylor, watching fragile hands bring giants to their knees, one truth became undeniable. The Krell had mistaken peace for weakness. They had mistaken mercy for fragility. And now, they were paying the price. The Krell capital world was a fortress of black spires and burning skies, a city that had never known the shadow of fear. For centuries, its halls had echoed with the footsteps of conquerors. Its chambers had dripped with arrogance, but now, silence reigned. The silence of defeat. Human banners hung in orbit above the planet, their fleet scarred but unbroken. Ships that should not have survived, vessels stitched from grief and iron, stood proud against the empire that had once mocked them. They did not bombard. They did not scorch the surface. They waited. In the grand hall of the Krell command chamber, Admiral Serac stood on trembling legs. His once gleaming armor was cracked, his scales dulled by the smoke of failure. Around him, generals who had once laughed at humanity now stared at the floor, their pride shattered. Before them stood human commanders, worn, gaunt, their eyes heavy with the weight of every sacrifice. They were not gods nor monsters. They were soldiers, mothers, fathers, children grown too quickly in the crucible of war. They carried scars inside and out. But in those scars lay something stronger than any Krell had ever understood. Serac's voice broke the silence, hoarse and hollow. Fragile creatures, you should not have endured. You should have broken. His claws shook as he pointed toward them. We shattered your colonies, burned your skies, buried your dead in mountains. And still you stand. Why? A human commander stepped forward, a woman with tired eyes and a scar cutting down her cheek. She did not shout. She did not sneer. Her voice was quiet, but it carried through the chamber like a blade through glass. Because we know what fragility means. It means every life is precious. Every breath matters. Every loss is felt. She let her gaze sweep across the kneeling Krell, her words sharp and steady. You thought pain would break us, but pain taught us to endure. You thought death would silence us, but death gave us reason to fight harder. You thought fragility made us weak, but fragility is our strength. The hall trembled with her words. The Krell, who had once mocked humans as insects, now listened as though the fragile species held the weight of the stars. Serac's chest heaved with bitter breath. And now, what will you do with us? Enslave us? Burn our worlds as we burned yours? Show us the cruelty we showed you? The commander's scarred face softened, though her eyes remained firm. No. That single word cracked the Krell more deeply than any weapon. No, she repeated. We will not become you. We will not trade one cruelty for another. You will lay down your arms. You will end your conquest. You will choose peace because there is no other path left. And in return we will not destroy you. We will give you the chance you never gave us. The room was heavy with disbelief. Krell generals lifted their heads, stunned. Serac's throat worked, but no sound came. Mercy? From the species he had mocked, broken, despised, Valar stepped forward, his voice low, almost reverent. They are not fragile. They are unbreakable. Serac collapsed to his knees. His ornate armor clattered against the stone floor. His claws dug into the cracks between tiles, his body shaking with something the great admiral of the Krell had never felt before. Shame. All around him, Krell leaders lowered their heads. Not in defiance, not in pride. In surrender, the humans did not cheer. They did not gloat. They stood in silence, shoulders heavy with the memory of every fallen comrade. Their victory was not one of glory. It was survival, bought with tears and fire. And so the galaxy learned a lesson carved in blood and iron. Fragility was not weakness. Fragility was carrying the unbearable weight of grief and still standing. Fragility was breaking and choosing to rise again. Fragility was humanity. The war had ended. The laughter of the Krell had been silenced forever. And from the ashes a truth remained. The fragile species had endured. And in enduring they had become unstoppable.